day. I mean, it's the only day in history that buildings have collapsed, through fire. Now, of course, two of the buildings, World Trade Centers number 1 and 2, did actually have planes go into them. But, those buildings collapsed, one in less than an hour and the other one in just over an hour.
Mm.
But, of course, the thing that, really caps it is that very, very few people are still aware that there was a third building, World Trade Center 7, that collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon, and that had certainly not had a plane crash into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the other thing is, of course, that 4 planes were supposedly involved in the events of that day, and yet the wreckage that has been photographed doesn't even, from all 4 sites, wouldn't even begin to make up one single plane.
That's right.
I mean, basically, if people really take a look at the many, many photographs and film footage that is available, then they would see for themselves that the physical evidence does not support the official version of events. But these guys know. I mean, they're very, very good at what they do. They're very good at creating the propaganda. So, that actually they create a story, and even though the pictures don't match the story, the vast majority of people will just take the story at face value.
Absolutely, and let's dive into this a little bit more later on, perhaps in the second segment, even the guys that are potentially behind this and how this connects with the New World Order. But
sure.
For right now here, let's go into this aspect about Codex Alimentarius, because as I mentioned, we've kind of I guess in a way glossed over this for the recent couple of shows here, and I really kind of want to get to the heart of the matter, as it were, here. So if you will, Ian, tell us a little bit of background on the Codex Alimentarius issue for us.
Well, first of all, Henrik, I mean, I've got to say that, I hope at the mention of the phrase Codex Alimentarius, your listeners don't switch off, because it's not exactly a phrase that rolls off the tongue.
Right.
And this is very, very deliberate. In fact, there's a document that's been produced by the National Health Federation, which is an organization that's based in the U.S., which looks after the interests of the complementary natural health community. And the headline on this document is, "Never heard of Codex? That's exactly what they want." And so because, the phrase is foreign, literally, to most people, then it just goes straight over the tops of most people's heads.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Codex Alimentarius simply means food code, which is why my blogspot is simply called foodcode.blogspot.com.
You got it, yeah.
And it was the Codex Alimentarius Commission was originally set up in the early 1960s. And I mean, I'm prepared to give it the benefit of the doubt and suggest that when the Codex Alimentarius Commission was first established, there were some benign intentions behind it. But basically, over the last 40 years, the whole Codex Alimentarius agenda has been hijacked by the corporations, and ostensibly by the major food corporations, and not least those most interested in genetically modified foods, and the pharmaceutical industry.
So you're mentioning the big companies are behind this. I mean, can we bung in Monsanto in there?
Monsanto are prime movers.
Yeah.
I mean, let's summarize some of the core objectives of Codex Alimentarius.
Right.
I mean, first and foremost, the objective is literally to eradicate all organic and natural farming. And that sounds outrageous. It's meant to be outrageous. It's meant to sound so outrageous that nobody will ever believe that they will do it. But, let's have a look at some of the evidence again. And how many people, and I tell you, it's not very many, but how many people do you think are aware that in 2004, the U.S. government forced the fledgling Iraqi government, of course it wasn't really a government, it was just a number of appointees who the U.S. were identifying as the Iraqi government, but they forced them to sign legislation which effectively prohibited all Iraqi farmers from saving their seeds. I mean, this is Mesopotamia. This is the cradle of civilization. This is the area where, as far as we're aware from recorded history, agriculture effectively, emerged and enabled us to start the process of civilization. And here we are, effectively destroying that whole ethos of self-sufficiency, by putting legislation in place that demands that the farmers destroy any seeds that they do happen to save, and that they are therefore forced to, by law now, to buy their seeds from Monsanto. And of course, the seeds that they are buying all contain the suicide gene, which means that there are no seeds to save. So consequently, a nation becomes totally dependent upon the corporatocracy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is completely outrageous. And if they'd have tried to do it anywhere else in the world, of course, it would have attracted some media attention on some level. But in Iraq, where effectively the U.S. controls the outflow of news via their embedded journalists, very, very few people are even aware that this has occurred. And this is a trial. This is a test. I mean, in the U.S., Monsanto have been deliberately sowing seeds in farms in the west of the country. Actually, this is in the U.S. and in Canada. And the reason they sow them in the west is obviously because they know the winds will blow from west to east. And so the GM crops, will contaminate the organic farms that are further to the east. And what Monsanto have been doing, and this is very well documented, and there's a wonderful documentary called The Future of Food, which actually looks at this case, where Monsanto was actually suing farmers where the wind had blown the seeds across onto their farms, and they were suing the farmers for illegally growing the GM crops because they hadn't got permission from Monsanto.
This is
Percy's. This is absurd.
Yeah.
And Monsanto knew that they wouldn't ultimately win the case, but that wasn't really the point. The point was to effectively bankrupt the farmers.
Yeah.
And bring the farmers effectively under their control, because once the other farmers saw what was happening to the farmers that they were suing, they would just sort of meekly bow over to Monsanto and buy the license to plant the genetically modified crops.
And this is the case of Percy Schmeiser that you're referring to here, isn't it?
Exactly. That's exactly correct.
Yeah. This is incredible. And, another aspect to this, of course, is for those who are meat eaters, the growth hormone issue to all of this. I mean, this is not only about all the veggies out there. This is something that's going to affect the meat. Isn't that right, too?
Absolutely. And, I mean, again, very, very few people in Europe are aware that the European Union is currently paying $150 million a year in fines to the World Trade Organization because the EU refuses to import beef that has been contaminated with the recombinant growth hormone. So it's the recombinant beef growth hormone, RBGH.
Yeah.
And the reason that the Europe doesn't import it is not that it never has any intention of importing it, it's just that the time isn't right. So in other words, the PR machine hasn't yet reached a point in Europe where they feel that the people will accept this contaminated beef without sort of some kind of uprising. So the EU determined that we'll continue to resist and we'll pay the fine, but that fine increases each year, and this recombinant growth hormone is very pernicious. And let me give you an example. I mean, in the course of my time in the oil field, I mean, I lived in Texas. I lived in Houston, Texas. And, there's a slogan in Texas that says everything's bigger in Texas.
Right.
Well, you got to believe it. I mean, when I lived there, the size of the people there, I mean, it's enormous. They're enormous. I mean, there is obesity in Texas like you haven't seen anywhere else in the world. And, call it a coincidence, but, of course, Texas is a major cattle state.
Right.
Beef is effectively the national food. There's beef restaurants, steak restaurants, wherever you go all around Texas.
Right.
And the growth hormone is used as a standard in Texas. And it clearly the evidence would suggest that it's not stopping in the beef. In the cattle, it's actually carried through in the meat, and it's carrying through into the people that are consuming it.
Yeah.
And, so certainly that was a trigger for me, and I stopped eating the beef while I was in Texas. So, yes, it impacts very much on the beef. Another area where it's impacting, of course, is in cloned meat.
Yeah, tell us about
that.
that.
And in the UK recently, I mean, the decision was taken. I mean, again, this is outrageous.